The SI Galactic Embassy on Earth had a minor panic in 2319. It was over soon enough. They confirmed that in the galactic stake algorithm, there was no way to assign to species not recognized as hypertravel capable. Therefore, the destruction of the Evendari was nothing the embassy needed to fret over. This destruction marked the exciting conclusion to a variety of entertainment projects based on the unsightly civilization. Evendari states had been in a thrilling years-long nuclear standoff, earning them a dedicated band of followers across the galaxy. All these followers looked back on histories that successfully navigated self-annihilation, so it was easy for them to forget that the chance of it happening was very real. Kazon 2 was a reminder. A few days of fire preceded years of radioactive smog, killing both the Evendari and just about everything else down there. This historic moment, the first live destruction of a civilization streamed across the virtual, brought out various voices claiming the SI should have seized the nuclear explosives when they had the chance. But that misstep was safely in the realm of SI mandate fundamentalism. Intervening in the progress of unaware species was to subvert their will, and so breach the right to public ownership of power enshrined in the Constitution. And now they were dead. This was the same political force shipping SI employees to live in the galactic core and take control of the higher order hyperlanes. And it was the same political force that brought about the important work the Earth Embassy could not spare a moment away from. They had inherited the task previously carried out by the Night Garden, managing the Oned'Qarak hive mind. The hive had been successfully convinced that the state of the galaxy, as it was around 2320, was roughly similar to how it had been 200 years prior, before a foolish Ultur explorer crashed a hyperlane-capable ship into the hive's planet, Irlauman. But they remained a ticking time bomb. The Oned'Qarak had a difficult relationship with the entire galactic community. The entity minds and the hive mind just didn't think alike, suffice to say. However, both minds needed fuel, and when it came to the control of natural resources, Hive and Individual could agree that they wanted it. Since the Oned'Qarak were simply incapable of giving other lifeforms similar standing to their own, it was an inevitability that they would stir up trouble. Fortunately for the galaxy, the hive mind worked slowly. While it had successfully navigated galactic bureaucracy to establish legal claims to a hefty web of hyperlanes, it hadn't yet worked out what to do with them. In fact, the planet Irlauman was the only place the hive inhabited, other than its mandatory space stations. The extreme density of the population on that world was more than the planet could bear. It was projected to be a mere decade from ecosystem collapse, and what would happen then? The worry was that the hive would swarm. Even if it resettled on a planet within its own borders, the geometric increase in size of the hive would simply render another world dead in short order. Worlds with resources perhaps better spent making transistors and bean curds. That's where the SI mandate stepped in. The hive had to be curtailed. This venture had the tacit support of the other governments. The Sovereign Coalition had rallied them to the cause, asking how could any of them ignore a species that did not know the meaning of self-control and would endlessly expand until nothing remained. After clarifying that it was the Oned'Qarak in question, the argument ground forwards to victory. The SI were clear to proceed with their simple two-point plan: remove as many assets, living and material from Irlauman as they could, and then cut off the hive's ability to relocate. The theory was that the hive could be conditioned out of their ravenous nature by making their own demise the only alternative. If the hive would truly do anything to survive, it would stop growing. Only on that condition would the SI relent, hopefully to a hive mind with a rationale bent to appreciate resource conservation. All this is why in 2321, the Nemurian fleet, now almost entirely not Nemurian to be clear, sailed into Oned'Qarak space and smashed any vessels they saw to pieces. The hive had an armada of ships ready to conduct their swarm, but they were detected at their deep space shipyard one jump from Ilauman, and hunted down with no questions asked. Only once this had been done did the hyperlink channels open for the SI to provide their explanation to the hive. The mood was completely flat. The hive's representative quietly asked if the SI had any information to provide on the recent quote-unquote failure of the fleet. The SI embassy team replied that they had deliberately destroyed it in order to influence the hive. Yes, after years of preparation for this operation, they had no grand lie, double agents, or alternate history to push. They had a plan to win with a frontal assault. They began to relay how their hive members were driven by the sense of satisfaction they received when serving the hive. The Oned'Qarak agreed and wished the other creatures could fathom it. The SI asked if they had considered mimicking the chemical response in their bodies artificially in order to pacify their desire to consume everything. The Oned'Qarak said they would consider it once they were done consuming everything. The SI asked why they wanted to consume everything. The Oned'Qarak said that if they did not, it would be consumed by something lesser, something that could be a threat. The Oned'Qarak's survival depended on expansion. When the galaxy was consumed, they would have so many members, so many neurons, that they would find a way to expand elsewhere. The upshot was that they had no interest in the SI's virtual consumption pitch. But the Oned'Qarak had a very exploitable motivation. If they believed they had to acquire and expend resources because their immortal survival depended on it, this could be turned around. The SI began to argue that in fact, their survival depended on them not consuming resources. Asked how that could be the case, the diplomats gave another straight-faced answer: because the SI were going to kill them all if they didn't obey. With no hint of offense, the Oned'Qarak conceded that in a scenario where consumption caused death, they would alter their behavior. However, they didn't believe that the SI were actually going to kill them all, so the threat was entirely declawed. The diplomats insisted they really would kill them, and the Oned'Qarak asked for proof. A shuttle packed with a few thousand hive entities was sent up to the SI fleet over the next few hours. The hive mind politely asked the SI to kill them all. As the hive had predicted, the silly individuals hesitated. The SI was indeed taken aback by this line of argument. It met their own brutal honesty with emotionless courage. While unexpected, it was not beyond explanation. The Oned'Qarak were known for their compartmentalized scientific style, that is to say, they operated on absolutes, influenced by their extreme age. The hive mind thought it had seen it all, and so held true this axiom: if it can happen, it has happened. In this situation, they had never witnessed another galactic power kill an Oned'Qarak, despite having chance and reason to do so. They concluded, then, that it must be impossible. They did not worry about having no understanding of why that should be impossible, save in the knowledge that it just was. All this meant that the SI had to prove them wrong. Not wishing to show ill will, a spacesuit was provided to the shuttle so that an occupant could travel outside. Then, with diplomatically announced malice, this occupant's helmet was forcibly removed by 2 drones, piloted by Admiral Komarov while he chatted with the hive. The hive noted the death, and suddenly the tone transformed. Belief that the SI were not psychologically capable of killing was a dam holding back the knowledge that they were technologically extremely capable. The embassy reiterated their argument: "We will kill you all if you don't follow our orders. Your survival depends on that, and we instruct you to cease building your hive." As per the grand plan, this literally left the hive with no choice, or more accurately, an inability to choose otherwise. As such, the hive's naivety about the state of the galaxy was flipped over to a sense of grim subordination. Thirst for life became fear of death. A fear rooted in deception, for indeed the SI had far too much scientific work at stake in the Oned'Qarak's survival. There was no other reality-based example of a hive species with technological aids that took them beyond chemical and ceremonial bonds. They were worth keeping alive whether they were merchandisable or not. But the Oned'Qarak didn't know this. They saw that the SI could kill them, and concluded in absolute terms that they would. This was the critical weakness of a hive mind. It took only one deception to bring the entire species to its knees, and the Oned'Qarak had 4 knees each and 4 trillion knees altogether. From then on, the hive was no longer permitted to construct spacefaring ships, was no longer allowed to stockpile resources, and had to transfer all of their surplus production to SI depots in the primary belt. Irlalmen was a very quiet place after that, save for the roar of engines ferrying containers into orbit. All the Oned'Qarak could do was bide their time and pray that their companion planet would carry them through that strange period. It was the first time they had prayed in thousands of years. What was the SI doing with all of the preserved resources being confiscated? Of course, the only thing their mandate allowed them to do. The decade saw a marked increase in living standards across their domain, which was a big deal for purist terrestophiles, i.e. the SI's employees. It helped everyone though, as even if you were only out of the virtual for a couple of hours on shift mending a power mesh, it was nice to do it while drinking the finest Silstack belly-up rum. It all hit different on the terrestrial. This increase in the abundance of just about everything wasn't universally felt though, because still most of what the SI manufactured was aimed specifically at humans. From clothing to keypads, many things about life in the SI were rather makeshift and clunky for the differently bodied. This was a leading factor in the election of the first non-human leader of the Council of Peers, one Barim Den Harik, an elderly Orassian explorer. After decades of migration in all directions, even the highest strata of galactic societies were mixing. The SI in particular made it easy with its constant elections and strict policy-only campaigning regulations. It wasn't long before clothing was not just arranged by size, but by skin pH and limb count. A bit of a hassle, but what on the terrestrial wasn't. On the cosmic front, the SI's borders were still creeping into the last untrodden hyperlanes. In 2326, a space station was constructed in close orbit of the galaxy core. Technically it was permitted to claim black holes in the same manner as stars, and it turned out that only the SI were impetuous enough to risk building in the most dangerous place in the galaxy just to get a few extra points on the board. Some peers at least considered it to be prestigious. There was only one core, and it was theirs. Theirs to orbit in a station that was always one misplaced bit of stellar debris away from falling to a death like no other. At the same time, the Imitharans provided the SI with a boon. They let the children into an unused annex that shot off from their miniature empire, with 8 hyperlaned stellar bodies for the claiming, and a couple of fertile planets. No doubt they were recycled, like Lost Crown, but an extra pool of space to call their own was another win for the SI. Questions were asked about the Imitharan motivation, and without fail it remained unknown. The official line from the Imitharans was that the diverse SI administration was ideal for the so-called cultivation of civilization. Engineers were shipped out to get cultivating then, trying not to think about what harvesting would entail in this analogy. By 2330, the SI were studying a certain moon with a barren but stable ecosystem in the Astor system. They needed to assess the environment to see what species would be best for establishing new industries in that distant cul-de-sac. As it happened, the air was 100% suitable for a most rare species, the Oned'Qarak. These were not entirely natural creatures. They were invertebrates, but walked in violet humanoid shells, enhanced with electrical muscles. Their small heads bore an opening on the front, from which a single slimy eye peered out of their armour. Silent and few in number, this species had arrived at Lost Crown the year prior in a single Phagesiphline cargo hauler, They could write in the pointillism-esque Vergesivlin script, which translated into other languages extremely poorly, but enough to determine that they were looking for a home. Further investigation determined that the Andigonj were former ocean dwellers, forcibly modified by the Holy Assembly in order to meet the criteria for 4-degree deviation sentience. In other words, they were making these mollusks count towards their population score in the stake algorithm and leaving them to drift about in space haulers. The SI couldn't stand for this mistreatment of a living being. They quickly took them in so that they would count towards their population score instead. That moon in the Astor system, cold and empty, was the nearest thing an ocean creature modified to breathe air could get to a home, so they were set to work. The SI's reputation for accommodating just about anyone actually contributed to a major breakdown in galactic relations. In particular, the Orassian Harmonious Administration took issue with the brain drain it was causing. The administration's academia was packed out with people who did not mix well with the rest of the population on account of shunning the multitude of religions celebrated across the state. It was common knowledge that beings of analytical mindsets were being recruited constantly by the Sustainability Initiative. There, the policy on religion was less overbearing. You could have one as long as you knew you were wrong. Both the SI and Sovereign Coalition began poaching Orassian elites and intelligentsia, which turned a harmonious administration into a rather more chaotic one. An internal culture war along lines of spirituality raged, one in which examples of human or Babaki spiritualists living in Orassian space were elevated as idols of a higher appreciation of reality. The administration's overseer, the highest-ranking politician, was a Babaki of this kind, which the Sovereign Coalition found shameful. They were less practical about things than the SI when it came to religion, with bitterness stemming from a long history of self-determination against a hostile environment. The notion that the Harmonious Administration was harboring defectors from the search for real truth was offensive, and Orassian pride in the matter broke some unseen straws. In 2333, the Coalition summoned the terrestrial engine to deal with the Haven of Deviants. The SI had their own deviants to hunt too. The Human Future Front operated enclaves in Orassian space, where religious regulations allowed them to evict anyone with the wrong genetics, let alone no genetics. The plan was simple: to attack the Harmonious Administration until they adopted democracy and ended state-sponsored proliferation of deadweight spiritualist philosophy. This was very much the Coalition's war, but as usual, it was the SI who had all the spaceships needed to carry it out. But the SI could come at the conflict from another angle, for in the mess of claims in the galaxy core, it was they and the administration who held the majority. A war would give the SI an excuse to gain complete control of cross-galaxy travel, and an excuse to fill the galaxy core with military infrastructure, a lasting investment in intimidation. With comments to this effect recorded in the Council of Peers' judgment, the matter was passed over to the MAD to be carried out. The crusade to the administration's capital would be a long one. The Coalition and the administration were entirely separated in the hyperlane network, despite being physically neighbours. To travel from one to the other, it was necessary to head south into the Tuxkan Combine first, and the Combine were firmly in the administration's pocket, with a freshly built battle fleet ready to block any such travel. They may have felt confident, but in 2334, the SI Space Navy ploughed into them with a cacophony of particle beams and EM-neutralized hydrogen torpedoes. The Coalition border system of Zarim lit up with the burning of fuels and melting of hulls. The Tuxkan ships might have been newer, but that aforementioned brain drain had left the SI in command of the best space engineers in the galaxy. Plus, the unlimited well of military experience flowing from the Virtual meant that when the time came, the ship's handlers knew what they were doing. In a campaign lasting just a few days, the Tuxkan Navy was cut apart, and the administration's shield was in splinters. It took 3 years for the fleet to fly deep into administration space, and nothing was done to alter their course on the way. They met the hastily assembled Administration Space Navy at last, and in the decisive battle of the war, detonated all that did not flee. SI designs were simply too sophisticated for the traditionally pacifist administration to resist, and the SI's capacity to manufacture large-scale weaponry was overwhelming. Just a few years into the war, the SI had enough state-of-the-art battleships to occupy the entirety of the Tuxkan Combine and the Harmonious Administration. Doing so would take many years more, but was inevitable. Now the scientific ascendancy of the SI was impossible to deny. Nor was it at all concealed how dangerous the philosophy of attempting to guarantee future existence was. As unstoppable attack fleets coursed through Orassian hyperlanes, who could not think back to that same image being used to drum up fear of the Oned'Qarak? With speed and determination, the SI was beginning to dominate the galaxy. And with life under the SI being so agreeable, there was no will to stop them. In fact, the only thing technically preventing the SI taking control of all living beings was that it was too complicated. Maintaining the utopian ideals at the core of their mandate took up 95% of SI resources at all times, and expansion had been dragging the poor, low-level employees through decades of perpetual crisis. But now that immigration was slowing down, star systems were claimed, and the stake algorithm sufficiently fed, the winds could finally relent. The SI had built a vast empire, and now had to do something with it. Most of its residents had plenty to do in the virtual already, but the Terrestophiles knew that some things only thought possible in virtual environments could be achieved in reality. The Ring World, the Penrose Sphere, the Stellar Orchard. These projects of cosmic engineering, the ultimate expression of practical sciences, were no longer distant speculation. The SI had won surplus enough to begin dreaming big, and building even bigger, fusing piece after piece towards the treasures in the stars.